Hey everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all of you. And this is the moment you've all been waiting for. These are my top 50 albums of 2018. For this one, I'm going to be going over all the albums from 50 to 11. And then in the next video, I will be talking about my top 10 of the year. 2018 was certainly a very interesting year for music, a very daring year, I must say. So you'll see how eclectic some of my favorites this year are. So anyway, let's just get right to it. At number 50 is Odetta Hartman with Old Rockhounds Never Die. A very interesting record that fuses together folk and psychedelia with a variety of different odd sounds. Number 49, the posthumous album from the late indie stalwart Richard Swift, The Hex. Number 48, Amen Goons with Freedom. Number 47, Saba with Care For Me, a very moody and reflective jazz rap album. Number 46, Calexico with The Thread That Keeps Us. Number 45, The Voidz with Virtue. And at number 44, Ambrose Akinmusire with Origami Harvest, a record that very beautifully fuses jazz elements with string quartets and rap vocals from Cool AD. Number 43, Paak with Oxnard. 42, Courtney Barnett with Tell Me How You Really Feel. 41, this one is probably the most unique here on this list because a lot of you may not know this artist, but he's a local. They're both local DC artists that I highly recommend you check out because they're both very talented. The rapper known as Flex Mathews and the producer known as Damu the Fudgemunk with their double album Dreams and Vibrations. Number 40, Blood Orange with Negro Swan. Number 39, the Goon Sax with We're Not Talking. 38, Tony Molina with Kill the Lights. 15 minutes of beautiful folk pop. Number 37, the Carters, aka Beyonce and Jay-Z, with their boastful collaborative album, Everything Is Love. 36, Marissa Nadler with For My Crimes. Number 35, MGMT with Little Dark Age, the album where I feel like the band has finally found the perfect balance between the accessible poppy hooks from their debut and the odder song structures and production from their last two LPs. Number 34, the 1975 with A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. The band really surprised me on this one, creating their most musically ambitious, but also their most thematically heavy album to date, as it does talk about some of the atrocities that can occur on the internet. "33 Young Fathers with Cocoa Sugar. 32, Jeff Rosenstock with Post. And then at number 31, Car Seat Headrest with the reimagining of their Twin Fantasy album, Twin Fantasy Face to Face. At number 30, it's Julia Holter with Aviary, an album that is going to take some people a few listens to get into, but I do personally view it as one of the most beautiful, cathartic, and mystical indie albums of the year. Number 29, Sleep with their 420 comeback album, The Sciences. I don't listen to a lot of metal, but this album, very surprisingly, I thought, was really good. The stoner metal pioneers have come back with a record that was a pretty kick-ass comeback. Number 28, Sophie with her long overdue debut album, Oil of Every Pearl's Insides, where she created one of the most twisted and wild yet strangely anthemic pop albums of the year. Number 27, Hop Along with Bark Your Head Off Dog, in which the Philly indie band does come through with a very ambitious, grand, and well-written third album. It feels more like a straight-ahead singer-songwriter album than it does like the high-energy indie rock that they had created on their breakout album, Painted Shut. Number 26, gotta give a shout-out to Denzel Curry for putting out one of the best rap albums of the year with Taboo, which I hopefully will be looked at by his fans as being probably his magnum opus. He comes through with some killer bars and an amazing kind of in-your-face personality, awesome production, and the features really added a lot to this album too. He's just like eager to like be 100 steps ahead of a lot of his SoundCloud rap peers. So that's it for the top half. That's it for the bottom half of my top 50 albums of 2018. So here we go into the top half. Here we go. Starting at number 25, one of my favorite new musical discoveries that I made this year was most definitely JPEG Mafia and his new album, Veteran. He's a local Baltimore rapper, so he's pretty much from my neck of the woods. I cannot thank the Needle Drop enough for like introducing me to this very talented rapper. Because if it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't have stumbled upon him. But he comes through with some of the most creative and abrasive experimental rap I've heard this year. And he channels a lot of different emotions here on this album. There are some songs that are like very hilarious, and other points that are very like dark and heartbreaking. But like most of the time, he comes through with incredible flows and plenty of personality, and some very clever samples too. A lot of these songs are pretty short. Most of them aren't any longer than 2.5 minutes, but they still feel like fully fleshed out songs and not just half-baked fragments. Number 24, shout out to Death Heaven for the album Ordinary Corrupt Human Love. Another album on here that does use elements of metal, but not really metal in the traditional sense. There's actually elements of shoegaze, goth, and piano pop to be found on here. And yet, all of these sounds work together really well. And I love these songs' ability to like kind of wander without boring the listener. I mean, they still keep you engaged the whole time, and it doesn't just feel like them wasting their time or anything like that. And I also love its versatility. Number 23, Spiritualized with And Nothing Hurts, an album that certainly has a very interesting story behind it. The band's frontman, Jason Pierce, is like didn't have a whole lot of money to record in a good studio, so he actually recorded a good chunk of this album at his house. But yet the band still sounds as grand and as gorgeous as ever. Certainly a very good indie pop album right here. Right here that's got some very beautiful cinematic arrangements. Number 22, one of the most surprising rock records of the year, which is Jack White's new album, Boarding House Reach. This was an album I didn't think too highly of when I first heard clips of it, but as I came back to this album, I began to kind of become more mesmerized by how wild, self-indulgent, how like adventurous this album is. It's really refreshing to see him really push himself, and I also love how with this album he sort of decided to just make the kind of album he wanted to make, and he didn't even, and he, you know, doesn't even care what the critics are gonna say, or like even some of his fans might say, even though I think a good chunk of his fans will likely be on board with what he's doing, and just making a record that's like from his heart. Definitely Jack White at his most Jack White right there. Number 21 is, gotta give a shout out to my gal, Nico Case, for putting out her strongest record in a while, Hell On, which is definitely her most accessible record to date, but also definitely her most emotionally intense. I mean, she's very much fearless on this album. While she may have been like a little afraid to express herself like this thoroughly on older releases of hers, she's just sort of facing down her fears and literally coming out with an amazing album that also does have plenty of artistic beauty to the production as well. So I definitely really applaud this album for that sort of factor. Number 20, the new Kali Uchis album, Isolation, where this is definitely one of the best albums made this year by a female artist, and a year which I definitely consider to be Year of the Woman. Like, most people would kind of say that applies to politics, but I would say that also applies to some of the best albums that came out this year too. I mean, nearly half of this list is female artists. And this is definitely one of the best. I love its diverse array of sounds, ranging from R&B, funk, neo-soul, hip-hop, folk, and even Latin pop. I mean, all the producers did a good job sort of creating a nice little sort of vessel for Uchis' voice, which has a very kind of shy yet beautiful, sweet as honey delivery. And I think some of the guest features really made this record quite successful as well, including people like Bootsy Collins, Tyler the Creator, Bia, Raycon, and Damon Albarn of Gorillaz, just to name a few. Number 19 is JID with the album DiCaprio 2, which on his debut full-length album for J. Cole's Dreamville label, JID comes through with definitely a very killer modern hip-hop album. While most of the people that you hear on the radio aren't really doing anything for me, JID is literally just, spitting his brains out. Creating an album with some very memorable bars and sick flows, and some great personality. I mean, he feels like your friend while listening to this album, which that doesn't happen really every day in hip-hop. And also some very cool sampling throughout. And the title sort of makes a reference to the actor Leonardo DiCaprio. And I like how the title sort of relates to JID as a character, because he sort of relates to him in some ways and stuff like that. So it really makes sense. And I will say that this album so far is the strongest release I've heard on Dreamville so far. Number 18 is the new Courtney Marie Andrews record, May Your Kindness Remain. An excellent alternative country album, definitely one of the best of the year. But also at the same time, it's not quite an alternative country record. I mean, if you enjoy some of the more Americana-laced kind of indie music, say His Golden Messenger, or like even Pine Grove, I think you're going to really like the material on this album. She's got a beautiful voice that will just destroy you. Some very emotionally gripping lyrics, and some gorgeous production. This is so far Andrew's that are most ambitious to date. I love the kind of noisy, shimmery tones of the guitars on here. That shows a little bit of post-rock flavor in there. Yeah, it's definitely yet another fantastic record made by a female artist this year. That certainly deserves more credit than it already has. Number 17, shout out to Let's Eat Grandma and their excellent second album, I'm All Ears, which sure, this album is a bit wonky. That's kind of one pretty, but that's definitely one pretty obvious trait about that band. And the album overall, like, comes through with some very strong hooks, as well as plenty of ambition and depth in its production for an indie pop record. I would never expect something this sophisticated to come out of two 19-year-old girls out of the UK. As well as plenty of expressive, honest lyrics that, like me as a teenager, can definitely relate to. And some really cool song structures too. It's definitely really refreshing to see this indie pop album that is kind of like pushing those boundaries and kind of setting fire to them with something a bit darker and gothier. For number 16, I gotta give a shout out to my dude, Father John Misty, for putting out his most emotionally dejected album to date, God's Favorite Customer. This album is definitely more unsettling and murky emotionally in comparison to the fantastic takedown of the human condition that was his last album, Pure Comedy. He's sort of dealing with some sort of life crisis or something like that, which could be a divorce with his wife or something like that. Not entirely sure. But not only is this album great for its emotional unrest, but also there are some great hooks and melodies to be found throughout this album. It's definitely Josh Tillman at his most accessible to date under this moniker. And it is really nice to see him strip things back with this album, because it definitely leaves more room for his songwriting to mature that much more. Excuse me. At number 15, Ambition is at its highest peak here on the new F'd Up album, Dose Your Dreams. This is by far probably the most ambitious punk album I've heard this year, and most certainly one of the best. And the reason for that being is because while this is definitely a gourmet punk album, as you may call it, it's not trying to be overly pretentious or anything like that. Matter of fact, there is some great energy and excellent hooks to be found on here, and solid guest appearances from a variety of different singers and musicians too. My boy Owen Pallett's on this album, for example, and it's definitely a hardcore punk album that is, a bit challenging, but it's certainly worth it, because it definitely has plenty of balls and passion and quality songwriting to be found on it. And then at number 14, shout out to one of my favorite bands out of Baltimore, which I'm wearing a shirt for, Beach House, for putting out their most ambitious record to date on 7. This is the adventurous, much needed step forward that I've been waiting to hear from this band, especially considering how underwhelming the 2 joint releases they put out in 2015 were. The band literally takes their otherwise pretty minimal calming indie dream pop sound, and turns up the volume a few notches by making stuff by far their most noisy and chaotic album to date. It's still no less beautiful and well written. And I will say that the second half of the song Dive is easily one of the greatest moments of their career. As for number 13, there's been a lot of pretty good collaborative rap albums that have come out this year. I already highlighted the Carters and also that new album, though I consider it more as an EP. The collaboration between Homeboy Sandman and producer Edan I thought was pretty good. But I think when it comes to collab rap albums as a whole, in the underground, this one is probably my favorite. Of course, it's the new collaboration between producer LaRange and rapper Solemn Brigham, known as Marlowe. An album where LaRange definitely comes through some very creative samples, including clips from what sounds like old movies, TV shows, or even news reports, and his very kind of sexy, kind of smooth as hell samples really complement Solemn Brigham's rap verses, which I certainly thought were very good, and they have nice chemistry together. So much so that I would actually kind of love to hear another project under this name. And also love the album flow of this record. It definitely feels like this really cool kind of almost like short film across 38 minutes. 30 minutes, which I definitely love that. At number 12, this album I consider to be the definitive indie album that for the year known as Year of the Woman. Of course, that's the new U.S. Girls album, and A Poem Unlimited. I mean, this album definitely is one of the strongest political indie albums I've heard this year, and certainly one of the most musically intriguing as well. I will say that actually this album and Jack White's new album have similar kind of aesthetics in terms of the production and the blending of different instruments, but they're both still very unique in their own ways. This album kind of includes elements of acid funk as well as definitely a variety of other genres as well, but it still manages to create this very cohesive and very commanding album, which definitely is which I not only really like how this album, yes, it does talk about Donald Trump and the normalization of kind of lies that were being fed all the time, but it also actually talks about Barack Obama a little bit as well. Well, so it's definitely refreshing to see a political album that's not being that way just for the sake of it, but actually has some purpose to it and really something agreeable to say about it. So I definitely recommend that one. And it certainly is not your run-of-the-mill indie album for if you just listen to the way it sounds. And finally, for this video, number 11, which number 11 is usually the hardest pick for a year-end list because, you always try and figure out how to narrow it down. But I decided to go with this one because it certainly is one of the weirdest, but yet one of the catchiest electronic albums I've heard this year. Clarence Clarity, Think Peace. After the overwhelming drop of singles that he's had over the last couple of years, he finally creates this new album that does include some of those songs in there, and it certainly is a lot of fun. I love how this album is very sophisticated, but it also just has some fantastic hooks on there, some great songwriting, and also the album flow of this one, I think, is awesome. Because I love how there are certain songs that have parts that repeat throughout the album, so it's kind of like an infinite loop sort of concept, but not really in a Nonagon Infinity in sort of way. But not really in a Nonagon Infinity kind of way. Yeah, the way that this album just like flows together is incredible. Incredible. And last thing I will say is Shadi's verse on the song Fold'em, I think really added a lot to that song. So that's it for my top 50 albums of 2018, excluding the top 10. But in the next video, I will go over the top 10.